So, Nicolas Fouquet here was the son of a government official on Richelieu's staff and was appointed to head the finance office by Mazarin in 1653. Like his boss, he had irritated many by his airs and ambition. His motto was, "Quo non ascendit," to what heights may I not climb? And in 1655, he hired Louis Laveau to build a chateau south of Paris that was to be known as Vaux-le-Vicomte, the old name of the property where the chateau was built. And here you see it from the air. Thomas Hoving, though he's become a bit of a clown of an art historian, may be right when he calls it the finest chateau in France, although it's far from the largest. Many of those who helped make it such a fine place, including the architect Laveau, the painter Lebrun, and the gardener André Lenotre, were to go on to work for Louis XIV himself at Versailles. It's still in private hands, although the owners live not in the chateau itself, but in the former servants' quarters to the left. In 1661, after the building was finished, Fouquet threw a party here, sometimes called the most famous in the whole history of France. The king had already begun an investigation into how a civil servant like Fouquet might have come by the francs required for something like this. And the party, to which anyone who was anyone in the world of French politics, the arts, and society was invited, has to be seen, I think, as a kind of last self-destructive manifestation of Fouquet's pride, which he just simply couldn't restrain himself from displaying, even though he must have known it would mean certain doom. Here's the chateau now at ground level. The guest list included Laveau, Lebrun, and Lenotre, along with the poet La Fontaine, who was commissioned to describe the event in verse. Molière, who was to supervise the performance of his play Les Fâcheux, Jean-Baptiste Lully, who was responsible for the musical entertainment, Vatel, the most famous chef in France, who undertook to provide haute cuisine for 800 diners, the Italian Torcelli, who was to set up the fireworks display, and of course the king himself. It was a warm August evening, and the tables were set up in the gardens you see now. La Fontaine's poem about the party claims that le ciel en fut jaloux, the gods themselves were jealous of all this. We'll hear more about Molière in a bit, but Lully was frequently to collaborate with him and wrote music to accompany many of his plays. At the time of the party, Lully was not yet the all-powerful king's favorite, but the next year he was named Louis's maître de musique and would go on to become the first great French opera composer, eventually producing about 20 in addition to all sorts of other music, before his untimely death, resulting from a gangrened infection caused when he hit himself in the foot with his conductor's staff. His music is now thought too bombastic to be great, but as someone once said of Wagner's music, perhaps it's really better than it sounds. We're going to see some more of the chateau while we hear part of the suite from Lully's opera Amadis. Here's Louis in the library, painted by Huas. This is the dining room. Monsieur Fouquet's bedroom.
Madame Fouquet's bedroom. The kitchen. And the chambre de roi prepared for the king, but he did not spend the night here. This is Louis Laveau, the architect. Charles Lebrun, the interior decorator. André Lenage, the gardener. La Fontaine, the poet commissioned to commemorate the evening. And Jean-Baptiste Lully, responsible for the evening's musical entertainment.
Here's a bust now of Jean-Baptiste Molière at Vaux in honor of his role in the party. As I mentioned, his play Les Fâcheuses was performed on the occasion. Molière was the son of an official of the royal household and was given a good education, but he turned down the chance to succeed his father at the court and opted instead for the precarious life of the theater, wandering around France with a troupe of actors for some 10 years, before his big break came with a performance of Corneille's Nicomedes before the king in 1658. After this, Louis's brother took over sponsorship of Molière's company, which gave it prestige, and Louis himself took over the sponsorship some years later. At the time of the party in 1661, however, Molière had still yet to write his most important plays. The performance at Vaux was on a temporary stage that probably looked something like this one, which was set up for a performance of his play La Malade Imaginaire, The Imaginary Invalid at Versailles. In Paris, Molière was allowed to use the Salle des Spectacles, which no longer exists, in the Palais Royal. There's not time here to go in detail into the complicated history of the theater in Paris, but the Comédie Française considers that it essentially came into existence with Molière's troupe. During the Revolution, it became established in its present location next to the Palais Royal as the Théâtre Français, or French National Theatre. Molière was, in fact, himself playing the role of the imaginary invalid when he collapsed on stage and died shortly thereafter. And since actors were required to renounce their profession before receiving the last sacraments, and Molière had not done this, it took the personal intervention of the king to secure his burial in sacred ground. Here's a portrait of Molière by Mignard. It is certainly to Louis's credit that he did support Molière throughout his career, despite the opposition of the church, which was especially offended by the antics of the hyperbolically hypocritical priest in Tartuffe, Molière's most celebrated play. But Molière made fun of all kinds of people and their foibles. In La Bourgeois Gentilhomme, he makes fun of social climbers. In Le Médecin, Malgré Lui, it's doctors. In The School for Wives, it's love and marriage. In The Miser, it's greed, and so on. I think of him as the greatest French dramatist, at least of his age, because his plays can still be performed and enjoyed, not just as representative examples of the literature of another age, but as pure and simple theatrical entertainment. It's often argued that Racine, the great tragedian who was contemporary with him, was a greater writer than Molière, but his staged plays put modern audiences to sleep. And even the Théâtre Français performs Molière more than Racine. Racine's plays are like Goethe's Faust. They make a bigger impression as literature than as staged theater. I doubt Molière ever thought anyone would read his plays at all, any more than most modern screenwriters expect their scripts to be read today. Well, here's another view of the King's Room at Vaux. As I said, Louis was supposed to spend the night here, but he didn't. Having seen enough, I suppose, to confirm his suspicions that, as he put it, Fouquet was stealing beyond his station, he left to ride back to Fontainebleau by torchlight around midnight, before the planned fireworks display. Fouquet was arrested a couple of weeks later and charged with embezzlement. The trial lasted 3 years, and most of the artists and intellectuals were on Fouquet's side because of his lavish support of the arts, but he was finally found guilty and imprisoned at Pignerolo in southeastern France. At the time of his death in 1680, Louis was apparently planning to free him. The chateau was confiscated by the king, but it was returned, minus most things of value, to Fouquet's wife and son in 1673. One of the chief enemies of Fouquet was Jean-Baptiste Colbert, a man Mazarin had recommended to Louis as a valuable administrator and who also wanted Fouquet's job. This is a portrait of Colbert now by a fellow named Lefebvre. Mazarin is supposed to have told Louis that he owed him a lot, but that he paid his debt in leaving him Colbert, who had first made himself valuable to Mazarin by acting as his agent in Paris at the time of the latter's flight during the Fronde Rebellion. Some think Colbert's desire for Fouquet's position as Surintendant of Finance led him to deal unfairly with the prosecution of his case against him. Some think Mazarin himself was more responsible for the financial mismanagement that was blamed on Fouquet. But the bottom line was that Fouquet was clearly living on more money than the king, who was his boss after all, thought it right or legal for him to have. In this Gobelin tapestry, we see Louis with Colbert at the Gobelin factory, which was given government sponsorship as part of Colbert's policy of encouraging art and industry. Tax collecting was reformed by him, standards of manufacturing quality were imposed, the navy was enlarged, overseas colonization and commerce encouraged, talented foreigners were welcomed, roads and transportation generally made more efficient. Probably the most famous phrase allegedly used by Colbert was "Il faut laisser faire les hommes," men must be left alone, or liberty is the soul of commerce as it's sometimes translated. But it's ironic that he's remembered for this, because in fact he did his best to regulate every facet of French commerce he could. Despite the fact that overall prosperity did increase dramatically, things weren't perfect. Many businessmen in France complained about the regulations on what they could make and how they could make it. And many businessmen abroad complained about the protective tariffs Colbert established on imports. Largely because of Colbert's efforts, Louis became the most powerful king in Europe, but this power tempted him into wars that threatened to wreck all of his ministers' work. Among the talented people who were invited to France was Gian Lorenzo Bernini, who arrived in 1665 to serve as a consultant on the king's plans for the Louvre. And while he was in Paris, he made this bust of Louis, still at Versailles in the Salon de Diane. Bernini was 67 by this time and was becoming a little crotchety. He told Colbert that one good Italian painting was worth everything in Paris, and he said that the only thing to do with the Louvre was tear it down and start over. This kind of talk didn't sit well with French artists, nor did the fact that the king gave him 13 one-hour sittings for this bust when none of them had ever had such an opportunity. This is one of the ideas Bernini drew up for the east front of the Louvre, and as I mentioned earlier, it looks a lot like the Palais de l'Institut, which Lavaux was building, and it may well remind you also, I think, of Borromini's curvilinear facades. Bernini is supposed to have been offended when Colbert wanted to discuss things like staircases and privies, which didn't seem to be indicated in the blueprints. And Bernini is supposed to have said something like, "I am an artiste, not a plumeur." The story's probably apocryphal. Even Versailles didn't have indoor plumbing. Anyway, Colbert told Bernini he'd get back to him. Their people would be in touch with his people. Bernini went back to Rome and the whole project was forgotten. This is the east front of the Louvre now, as it was actually built. The architect who got the job was essentially an amateur, Claude Perrault, the brother of Charles Perrault, famous as the writer-editor of the Mother Goose Tales. He was, of course, French, but this looks as Italian as anything Bernini himself could have designed. Pilasters, columns, pedimented windows, and a flat roof with a balustrade, one of the first ever put on an important French building. Versailles was under construction at the same time, and it, of course, was to have a flat roof also with all kinds of classical decoration. It's the flat roof, though, that's really distinctive. The French had been using the rest of the Italian style for a century by this time. Despite the invitation to Bernini and the look of the Louvre, which shows the French themselves certainly still respected Italian art, the reign of Louis XIV can be said to mark a turning point in the history of European art generally. From Louis's day on, France, not Italy, will be looked upon as the source of the best things in civilized life, and that's a conception that still has some power. Another indication that the French themselves, however, still looked upon Italy as a source of at least some artistic inspiration, however, is the fact that Colbert founded the French Academy in Rome as a place where French artists could study there. Bernini was in fact made an honorary director, but the most important thing produced under his nominal supervision was this statue of the king on horseback, which I think looks pretty good, but that's not what Louis thought. He had it put way out in the backyard here at Versailles, where it was subjected to such frequent vandalism in the 20th century that it was finally taken off its pedestal and hidden somewhere. Eventually, it re-emerged in a new incarnation as a bronze copy of the original in the new pyramid courtyard of the Louvre. It clearly owes a lot to the equestrian statue of Constantine we saw earlier, which Bernini was making for St. Peter's at the same time. Here's the king on horseback again. This is the picture we saw earlier at Vaux. During Louis's reign, the French were involved in a series of wars of growing magnitude. The first was the War of the Devolution, which lasted from 1665 to 1678, and which was fought over the Spanish Netherlands. Louis claimed that since the Spanish never gave him the dowry he'd been promised with his marriage to Marie Therese, he was entitled to the Spanish Netherlands as compensation. This resulted in an alliance that would have been unimaginable 50 years earlier. The Dutch actually came into the war on the side of the Spanish, worried that if Louis did get the Spanish Netherlands, he wouldn't stop there. Here's a bust of Louis de Bourbon, the Grand Condé, about whom we heard earlier as the victor at Rocroi and as the enemy of Mazarin. The retirement of Condé from the army in 1675 and the death the same year of Marshal Turenne, the other great French general of the day, who had fought against Condé at the Battle of the Porte Saint-Antoine, along with the entry of England and the Empire on the opposite side, meant that Louis didn't get as much out of the war as he might have, but France still acquired, at least for the time, Alsace, Lorraine, and Franche-Comté. This is the Chateau of Chantilly now from the air, and it was to this place now Condé retired. He was 54, but he could have given up the soldier's life much sooner. It's a measure of just how much men like to fight that he spent years in tents on muddy battlefields when this was waiting for him. The original chateau was built here by Anne de Montmorency, Condé's great-great-grandfather on his mother's side back in the 16th century, but it has undergone many changes since then, including major rebuilding by the Duc d'Aumale, his distant descendant in the female line in the 19th century, who willed it to the French Institute since he had no children. Here you see it now at ground level. Molière wrote Tartuffe, his most important play, while he was a guest here, and La Bruyère, who was the tutor to his Condé's grandson, wrote his Caractère while he was here. In that memorably satirical work, he says that the worst thing in life is to be in love and have no money. He says that most men spend the first half of life making the second half miserable. The difference, he says, between doctors and quacks is that doctors let you die and quacks kill you. La Bruyère was also the librarian here, and this is the library now, the most famous book in which is the Très Recherches of Jean-Duc de Berry, which some of you heard about a long time ago in these lectures. It's kept in a spatial vault now, however, not on a shelf. In 1671, there was a big party here that rivaled the one 10 years earlier at Vaux, and many of the same guests were present, including the chef Vatel, the Wolfgang Puck of his day, and what happened to him on this occasion is the subject of one of the most famous letters by Madame de Sévigné. And this is the Galerie de Serre now, the Staghorn Gallery of Chantilly, named after the antlers mounted high on the walls. It turned out that at this big affair, with, again, Louis himself as a guest, there was not going to be enough fish for everyone, and Vatel, in despair, committed suicide. Wolfgang Puck would probably have just served smaller portions. When told of Vatel's death, the king is said to have remarked that it was a result of too refined a sense of honor in a chef. This is the Hotel des Invalides now from the air. Louis is famous, of course, for his self-indulgence, but it should be remembered that one of the biggest things he built was for some of his neediest subjects, though it was in part financed by a tax on soldiers' pay. This was originally a giant military hospital and residence for wounded veterans. The architect of the main building was Liberal Bruant, and the dome of the church was built by Jules Ardouin Mansart. Here you see the main courtyard. The complex is now mostly occupied by the Army Museum, but 70 Invalides are still housed here in memory of its original purpose. In Louis's day, it housed 7,000. This is the Église du Dôme, which is really attached like a chapel to the Église Saint-Louis on the north. This is most famous, of course, because of the presence of the tomb of Napoleon, which we'll see next quarter. To some, the size of the dome seems disproportionate to the size of the building, but it is always regarded as the architectural masterpiece of Louis's reign in Paris. It probably actually achieved something like the result Bramante and Michelangelo originally intended at St. Peter's, a building thoroughly dominated by its dome, and at nearly 350 feet high and brightly gilded. It in fact dominates much of the whole city. Here you see the interior, the painting of which was supervised by Mignard when he was over 80. Mignard, by whom we have seen several portraits, was a rival of Lebrun, but outlived him and finally took over all of the latter's many positions. Turenne, the great French general of Louis's age, is buried here, and one of the most well-known pieces of music by Lully is the Turenne March, which is so well known because Bizet used it transposed from major to minor key in his Arlésienne suite, and we'll hear it now. saw the Place de Vosges earlier this quarter, and this is number 1 Place de Vosges, where one of the most interesting writers of Louis's day was born, Madame de Sévigné. At the time this picture was taken, it was for sale, but it may still be, because to buy a place like this commits you to a lifelong battle with the various bureaucracies which oversee historical monuments in Paris. In any case, Madame de Sévigné was the daughter of a baron, but both her parents died before she was 7, and she was raised by relatives. Her early marriage to a rake of a nobleman ended soon when he was killed in a fight over one of his mistresses. Left a widow at 25, she never remarried and devoted most of her affection to her daughter, who married the Comte de Grignan and spent most of her life far away in Provence. This separation, however, gave her the occasion to write thousands of letters, some 1,500 of which survive. Virginia Woolf accuses her of neurotic perversion, but she didn't have a daughter, and it's better to be neurotic than boring in any case. She spent a lot of time at the Chateau of Les Rochers in Brittany, but her Paris home was in the oldest part of what is now the Musée Carnavalet, the Carnavalet Museum, and you see the entrance courtyard of that building now. Most of the museum exhibits are in the parts of the complex to the north and west of this courtyard, which were added in the 19th century when the city acquired the property, and it is now also attached to the Hotel Le Pelletier de Saint-Fargeau. The exhibits in general are devoted to the history of the city of Paris and include about 20 very interesting ones devoted to the development of styles in French furniture and decoration. The exhibits in the Hotel Le Pelletier de Saint-Fargeau are mostly devoted to the Revolutionary era. Here's the garden courtyard of the complex now. Earlier I mentioned her account of the party which resulted in the suicide of Vatel, and even though she wasn't always present at events like the Chantilly affair and was rarely in the presence of the king, she knew everybody and was a great collector of gossip in all its forms, much of which she passed on to her daughter and to us through her letters. This is a portrait of her by Lefebvre. Here's one memorable story she heard. One day the king was complaining to the Comte de Guiche, who had a reputation as a literary critic, about how would-be poets, and Louis was the soi-disant poet himself, were always sending him their stuff and about how worthless it was. "Look at this, Monsieur de Guiche," he said. "What do you think of this?" Guiche glanced at the poem and said, "Oh, your majesty, this is just horrible. Throw it away." Louis raised his eyebrows, drew himself up and said, "Well, actually I wrote this myself." "Oh," said de Guiche. "Oh, I see. Let me read it again, sire." And on the second reading it was pronounced worthy of Racine to the king's apparent satisfaction. This is one of Madame de Sévigné's letters on display now at the museum. On another occasion she mentions how 2 old generals bent over to give each other the continental kiss on the cheek and got their medals so tangled up they couldn't get loose. This is the Chateau de Grignan now, which was the home of her daughter, to whom the letters were sent, most of the famous ones anyway. Madame de Sévigné did not like the place and only came here twice and died on the second visit. On setting out from Paris, she wrote that God had provided forgetfulness so that she could bear a child more than once and visit Grignan more than once. She also said that life was full of sharp pangs, but on the whole she preferred it to death. As I mentioned earlier, when Louis tired of Mademoiselle de la Vallière, Madame de Montespan became her successor as favorite mistress, and this is an anonymous picture of her with some of their many children, hers and Louis's, which were nominally legitimized by royal fiat. She was to remain in favor for at least 15 years, although the fact that the king also had on and off relationships with various other women during this period finally led Montespan apparently to consort with a woman named Catherine Monvoisin, to concoct love potions that might have killed someone without Louis's durable constitution. Montvoisin and several women like herself were convicted of witchcraft, however, and executed in the so-called Affair of the Poisons, in which various other prominent people, including Racine, were accused of trying to murder enemies with the aid of witchcraft and pharmacy. But Louis squelched further investigation when Montespan herself was implicated. In 1668, after Montespan had been the king's mistress for several years, Madame de Maintenon, to give her the title by which she is best known and whom you see in this picture by Rigaud, was hired as a governess for her children. Madame de Maintenon had already lived an amazing life. She was probably born in the prison of Niort, where her father had been locked up for debt, and she was then taken to the West Indies after his release. Returned to France after his death, she was required at 16 to marry and nurse the crippled writer Paul Scarron to avoid a convent for life, but this turned out to be a blessing in disguise, since his house was a resort for many important literary and politically connected people, including Montespan, and after Scarron's death, she took the job as governess. The king soon liked her better than Montespan, and rewarded her service with this chateau, Maintenon, from which she took her title. About the time of the Queen's death, Marie Therese's death in 1683, Montespan entered a convent, and Louis apparently married Madame de Maintenon morganatiquement, that is, in such a way that she would not be recognized as queen, nor would any children born to them have any claim on the throne, but she was already nearly 50 years old. Historians still argue about the effects of her influence, but it is now generally thought that whether for good or bad, it was not that powerful. She did not spend much time at Maintenon, but why should she have spent time there when she could live here at Versailles? After the Fronde Rebellion, Louis was never that fond of Paris or its people and began having this built 10 miles west of the city in 1661. Until it was ready for him to move in, he lived mostly at Saint-Germain, 10 miles to the north, in the so-called Chateau Neuf that no longer exists. Louis XIII had built a chateau here in the 1630s, which still more or less survives on the east side, but Louis XIV had it encased in his own work and then extended to monumental length on the north and south. You're looking east in this picture at the garden facade. Louis Laveau, the architect of Vaux-le-Vicomte, was the original architect here, followed by Jules Ardouin-Mansart. The gardens were laid out by Lenotre and the interior decor was under the direction of Lebrun, both of whom had also been employed at Vaux by the ill-fated Nicolas Fouquet. In this picture you see the main court on the east side toward Paris, built by Louis XIII, which remained the heart of the whole place. The king's private apartments are actually in this section, and he rarely saw anything of the giant wings, which were divided up tenement-like among the swarms of courtiers who lived in the place, which has, in fact, often been compared to a beehive. There was no indoor plumbing, and there was only one small kitchen for the king's meals, so servants were kept busy carrying chamber pots out and catered food which was offered for sale in the courtyard inn. It's hard to understand the mentality which led people who had vast estates and chateaux of their own to give them up for the conditions of life at Versailles, which required, in addition to some real physical hardship, obedience to a social code and ceremonial protocol of a complexity rarely seen outside women's bridge clubs. This is the chapel at Versailles, and it's considered one of the more successful parts of Jules Ardouin-Mansart's work there, so we'll see it in a little detail now and hear another piece of music by Jean-Baptiste Lully. This is called Plaude la Tariglia, Rejoice, happy France. It was written to celebrate the baptism of the Dauphin.
The interior looking east now. And the altar area with the tetragrammaton in the triangle, the Lord's name in Hebrew, Yahweh, surrounded by the triangle of the Trinity. Looking back toward the royal box, and the ceiling by Antoine Coypel, the Lord announcing the coming of his Messiah.
Originally, there was a big staircase, one flight of which went toward the king's apartments, and one flight of which went toward the queen's, but all that survives is this model. It was destroyed when this part of the palace was altered in the 18th century. The decoration of the state apartments, which parallel the private apartments of the king and queen around the courtyard, is primarily inspired by the planets and the classical divinities associated with them, and this is the Salon de Venus, the Venus room. We'll concentrate in this visit on the rooms which still have their Louis XIV, Louis XIV decor. Many other rooms were remodeled and redecorated for Louis XV, Louis XVI, and on into the 19th century, and we'll see more of them, as well as the gardens next quarter. This is typical French Baroque decoration now, heavy with a lot of metal and stone, geometrical patterns, straight lines, square corners, classical motifs, and so on. The Louis XV rooms we'll see in a few weeks will be in the 18th century Rococo style, with much more wood and plaster, more delicate and feminine, and with few straight lines. This is called the Diana Room, another in the Louis XIV Baroque style. I think H.D.F. Kiddo was probably thinking of Versailles when he said that Baroque art alone was enough to justify the French Revolution. But as we'll see next quarter, in art, the Revolution was more a reaction against the Rococo than the Baroque. On the right is the bust of Louis we saw earlier by Bernini. Like Hadrian, Louis professed to be a Stoic, even in the midst of luxury, however, on a truly imperial scale. Indifference, he said, is the mark of a gentleman, and a gentleman doesn't complain about the weather. This is the Salon des Gardes de la Reine, and several of the Queen's guards were killed here when the royal family was forced to move to Paris in October 1789, as we'll also see next quarter. This is the big relief of the king in the Salon de Guerre, the war room. It's by Antoine Coissebox, the most important sculptor of Louis's day in France. Will Durant calls Louis, in fact, the greatest patron of the arts in history, and while that is an unusual claim, outside France anyhow, I think it is defensible. He would probably get more credit as an art patron if there had been greater painters and sculptors around, but that's not his fault. Despite using the French spelling of the word civilization, Kenneth Clark doesn't even mention him in that book, which is really indefensible, I think, especially considering the influence he and the French had on the rest of Europe for a long time to come. Here you can see that relief in the Salon de Guerre at the north end of the Salle de Glace, the pièce de résistance of the whole palace. We're going to see this a little more closely now and hear perhaps the most famous piece of music from Louis's day in France, the fanfare by Jean-Joseph Mouret, who worked for the Duc de Maine, one of Louis's illegitimate sons.
Okay, we'll finish Louis' 72-year reign next quarter then, at the start of the Age of Napoleon series.